The ideas expressed in the following presentations are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of ACI or its committees. ACI web sessions are recorded at ACI conventions or other concrete industry events and will be made available for viewing free of charge for 1 week. Thereafter, they will be archived on the ACI website or added to ACI's online CEU program, depending on their content. You can earn continuing education credits through ACI's online CEU program. Visit www.concrete.org to register. ACI conventions provide an opportunity for networking and for keeping up to date with the latest in concrete technology and practices.
And our first speaker is going to be Tom Adams. Tom is the Executive Director of the American Coal Ash Association. And as many of you know, there's been many things afoot in the area of regulations that affect coal ash utilization. And so Tom is going to give us an overview of what's been going on and where things are going and what we might expect in the future from our elected officials, I presume. So, Tom?
Thanks, Larry. Okay, that's a little bit better. I thought the first session was excellent, and particularly when it comes to what We Energies has done in its approach to beneficial uses is really the model for the rest of the country. And if our folks in Washington would take a look at what Wisconsin's done as a state in terms of their environmental regulations, and also what We Energies has done as a company, we wouldn't have some of the problems we've got today. In Wisconsin, the recycling rate for us all CCPs is over 90%. And as Bruce said, at We Energies, the recycling rate actually exceeds 100% in some years. That's consistently close to 100%. So that really is a success story, and it has been for a long time. So that was a great presentation. And so in this session, we want to talk about nothing to do with science, because what's going on right now in terms of solid waste regulation of CCPs, it has nothing to do with science. It has everything to do with political science or science fiction. You can take your own pick. In terms of the American Coal Ash Association, we were founded as the National Ash Association back in 1968. Our membership represents not only fly ash, but these other products as well. So within our membership of 160 members, we have everything from very, very large utilities to individual members, academics, contractors, marketers, equipment people, all kinds of different interests. So we have a lot of tribes within our association that we need to pay attention to, but fly ash is certainly the marquee product, and you can see the different common applications for the rest of these products. The real theme here is that when you're looking at CCPs and the way they're marketed, they literally are in our houses, homes, schools, hospitals, nursing homes, these kinds of things. You can literally reach out and touch them in every aspect of your personal life. So anything that brings a hazardous waste name to coal combustion products has a very serious implication for the public, because in fact we are all around you every single day. In terms of scope of production and use, how much ash is produced by burning coal to create electricity, somewhere between 5 and 10% of each ton of coal that's burned leaves behind some kind of residue. Those residues, again, fly ash, bottom ash, boiler slag, and certainly the synthetic gypsum that's produced is something that's come along with the advent of scrubbers on power plants. We're producing somewhere around 130 million tons a year of CCPs. We call them products because we really believe they have a very valuable place in the market, and we don't think of them as byproducts or waste at ACAA. It's the second largest waste stream in the country, right behind municipal solid waste or household trash. So we're talking a lot of stuff. And typically, ash that is not put into beneficial use is disposed into ash ponds or landfills. We believe the solution to disposal problems is not to dispose. In terms of recycling history, it's good that we have a lot of knowledgeable people in the room here. In case I keel over during this presentation, these people can step up and finish this thing, and you won't miss a beat. But If we're looking at recycling history in the last, since the turn of the century, back in the year 2000, we were recycling about 29.5% of the ash that was produced. That was a pretty consistent number through the 90s. We'll see some reasons here that ash recycling picked up. The first one was that EPA in the year 2000 made a final determination, what they called a final determination, that coal combustion products did not warrant management as a hazardous waste. So all this time through the 90s and previous, and we'll get to a little legislative history here in just a second, folks were kind of wondering, is EPA going to manage this stuff as hazardous waste or not? Well, in the year 2000, they said, no, we're not going to do that. So the money that is required to get an industry really going started to flow into the recycling markets. Companies started to invest, not only utilities, but entrepreneurs of all kinds started to bring money into the market because they had regulatory certainty that this money was going to be protected from solid waste regulations. At the same time, a couple of years later, a coal combustion products partnership was created between the EPA, Federal Highway Administration, U.S. Department of Agriculture, the utilities represented by the Utility Solid Waste Activities Group and ourselves. And this group had a mission to increase recycling of coal combustion products and worked very hard at doing that through having workshops and all kinds of things to inform people about how all those products were used and what the benefits were. Very successful program. Combined with that final determination and the C2P2 program, ash recycling took off to 44% in the year 2008. So we had roughly an increase of 50% in the rate of recycling, but the other important factor to look at is during that period of time, the coal burden, the total tonnage of coal burden took off as well. So you're talking about a huge increase in tonnage. So by any measure, this is one of the most successful environmental protection stories of our time. We all know that some things happened in 2008, which we'll touch on in a minute. Since 2008, the recycling rate has been stuck at 43%. Okay, markets have taken a look at what's going on, and they've said, until the EPA gives us some regulatory certainty right now, we're not going to increase what we're doing. Utilities, by and large, have said, look, we have an exposure in terms of liability for what we've been doing for decades, safely, by the way. There is not a single damage case which can be related to beneficial use. We're going to continue to allow these products to go into markets we've been in, but we're not going to allow any new sources to come online or new applications until we know exactly what EPA is going to do. The liability is already out there. And today, in terms of regulations, in terms of solid waste, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today, is solid waste, not air issues or water issues as it relates to fly ash. There are no federal regulations that exist for beneficial use or disposal of coal combustion products. So there's nothing that's on the books on a federal level now. Many states do have their own regulations, and those regulations come in the form of state laws, regulations from state environmental departments, or in some cases other types of restrictions. For example, to demonstrate that last point, in the state of Florida, if a material is called a hazardous waste, it cannot be used for a beneficial use no matter what. So the minute EPA, in the case of Florida, would designate the material to be hazardous waste for any reason, even if it's only for disposal, beneficial use in the state of Florida stops. In the state of Texas, there's a provision in the standard highway specifications, DOT specifications, which says something similar. If the material is declared to be a hazardous waste, it cannot be used on the DOT project. So these are two examples of the restrictions that exist around the country on a state level. But again, there's nothing on a federal level that talks about regulating disposal or beneficial use of coal combustion products, and EPA views that as a problem. Why do they want federal regulations? Or why federal regs? Well, we go back and look at the regulatory history. Back in 1976, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act came along, which covered disposal of certain materials. There were problems with RCRA. So in 1980, the Bevel Amendment came along and fixed some of those problems. Under the Bevel Amendment, in terms of CCPs, EPA was directed to report back to Congress on the safety of the material and what should be done with it. They finally got around to reporting in 1988 for the first time. They had another report in 1999. And that started the two determinations by EPA that the material was not worthy of hazardous waste management. In 1993, the first of the two determinations was made that the management was not warranted as hazardous waste. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the final determination came in the year 2000. both under President Clinton and EPA Administrator Carol Browner. Some folks say, well, year 2000, that had to be a Bush deal. It was not a Bush deal for that final determination. It was Carol Browner as EPA Administrator, no friend of the coal-fired generation of electricity, and President Clinton. So these were both significant points. Back on December 22nd of 2008, which was 2 days after I accepted the current job that I have, it was a great time, wasn't it? We had a massive ash spill in Kingston, Tennessee, where 5.5 million cubic yards of ash got out of a wet impoundment. About 3 million yards of material ended up in the waters around the power plant, about 1 billion gallons roughly in liquid quantity. In that particular event, which was called, until the BP spill in the Gulf, that was called the biggest environmental catastrophe in the history of the U.S. Now, what qualifies a catastrophe? In this case, there were no serious injuries, no deaths. There was 4 houses destroyed. There was other property damage. So, if you're looking at terms of catastrophe and an impact on humans, it really was not that big. However, it was a big spill and had to be cleaned up and cost them over $1 billion to clean it up. After that spill, in December 22nd, January 2009, we had the new administration take office, and at the same time, they had to appoint a new EPA administrator, and we got Lisa Jackson as the nominee, and she promised during her confirmation hearings to deliver regulations for coal ash disposal by the end of 2009, which she did, and we'll get to that in just a second. And of course, at this point in time, the folks that are opposed to using coal for generation of electricity saw this as a perfect opportunity to ramp up their efforts to get rid of coal, or at least make the rules surrounding the use of coal or the cost of using coal so high that utilities will turn to other sources of energy. So these things all lined up to give us the problem that we have today. I'm not going to touch on a lot of the details here because many of you are familiar with some of this stuff already, and I'd be happy to answer questions and fill in gaps if you think there are gaps in what we're talking about. EPA has been working since Carol Browner, since Lisa Jackson came into office to develop regulations for disposal. They did publish a regulation in June 2010. That regulation, when it first went over to the Office of Management and Budget, stated a preference for hazardous waste regulations to be managed by EPA. If we look at the problem with the regulation, we're not in the disposal business. We're really at ACIA. We're in the beneficial use business. We don't pay attention or comment on disposal unless it affects our ability to recycle. In this case, putting a hazardous waste on ash for any reason does affect seriously our ability to recycle. We became collateral damage in EPA's efforts to regulate disposal, and the focus by EPA is really on ash ponds, wet disposal. They're not as focused on dry disposal in landfills. But we became collateral damage in this whole big effort. Stakeholders. This was a very, very important part of what happened when EPA introduced that regulation in June 2010. During that period between June 2010 when they introduced their regulation and the time they closed comments on this proposed regulation, 455,000 comments were submitted to EPA, a lot of them by folks like you, folks across the country that are users of the material, specifiers of the material, marketers, generators from a broad spectrum, governors, mayors, all kinds of different groups, including labor unions, weighed in and pushed back on the EPA. On the other side of the fence, there are 3 groups that were in favor of hazardous waste regulations. They included, again, anti-coal activists. The second group was companies that manufacture products that compete with products that are made with coal combustion products. For example, boiler slag is used in about 80% of the shingles on the roofs of homes around the country. A company came in and said EPA should regulate ash as hazardous waste because in fact, these guys manufacture recycled glass, which would replace boiler slag and shingles. So they're advocating for declaring boiler slag as to be a hazardous waste so that they can gain market share. So that's the second group. And the third group are folks that are in the business of providing fuel that is an alternative to coal. And the number one would be natural gas.
If you recall, a while back, the Sierra Club showed up with something called Beyond Coal. They were going to take us beyond coal to other energy sources that would liberate us from this dirty, hazardous, toxic material. The Beyond Coal program was fueled by about $27 million from the natural gas industry. So we had those three groups as the ones advocating to EPA in favor of hazardous regulations. Everybody else in the civilized world was on the other side of the fence. Those stakeholders that did weigh in by submitting comments and by going to OMB and setting up meetings with OMB were critical to stopping EPA in its tracks from doing hazardous waste regulations. So EPA had something to figure out, how do we regulate? And they can't answer this question today because they painted themselves into a corner. How do we regulate disposal as a hazardous waste without crippling, just not crippling disposal, I should say crippling recycling? That slide is incorrect. Say, how do we regulate without crippling recycling? Okay? If EPA wants regulatory authority to oversee disposal as hazardous waste, simply because the law gives them primary enforcement authority over hazardous waste disposal. Non-hazardous waste disposal, that authority lies with the states. And again, they don't trust the states. So that's what's been happening at EPA. They continue to work on rulemaking. Recently they said they can't possibly have a rule done before the end of 2013. With other things that are in the pipeline with EPA rulemaking, it really looks like they can't do anything before 2014, probably second, third quarter. They are under no congressional mandate or court mandate to act, so they have no deadline to meet. So in theory, they could go on and on and on with trying to create a regulation without end. So EPA continues to work, and quite frankly, it looks like they're getting tired of this issue and would like somebody to solve it for them. That somebody would be Congress. Congress has gotten involved in this. This is a real civics lesson on the federal level, because we've talked about executive branch already with EPA. Here we go to the legislative branch with Congress, and we'll finish with the courts in just a second. The U.S. House of Representatives has passed a bill 5 times, soon to be 6, with bipartisan support to direct EPA to manage coal combustion product disposal as a non-hazardous waste. Primary sponsors David McKinley, Republican of West Virginia, who is in his second term in Congress, who is a licensed engineer, has had his own design practice for a long, long time, which he had to resign from to run for Congress. McKinley understands CCPs, particularly fly ash, and used them successfully for a long, long time, and is just outraged that EPA would do what they're doing. So McKinley is our champion in the House on this issue. And under his plan, EPA would be directed to create a management program very similar to what's used for municipal solid waste. Managed by the states, permitted by the states. Everything goes just fine according to that program, according to most people. And this would just mirror what's done with household trash. And a very easy program to implement. The state regulators who would be responsible for creating this program and managing it are very comfortable with it, so we can have this up and running in about 2 years. If you go to hazardous waste regulations for disposal of CCPs, you're looking somewhere, depending on how much litigation you get, 5 to 10 years. So on the one hand, folks say we need to have protection of human health and the environment, we need to create a regulation, and if we go hazardous waste, it could be 10 years before they see that protection in place. If you do it under this program, you're getting it within 2 years. And utilities support this program as well. And the bipartisan group of senators moving across the street to the Senate, where everything is always done better, they created a bill, S-3512, in the 112th Congress. Had 12 Democrats and 12 Republicans as sponsors, so you got roughly a quarter of the Senate supporting this particular legislation. We didn't make it through in the 112th Congress. We had a couple shots at passage, and we couldn't get it through, so a new coalition is being developed in the current Congress. Some of those 12 Democrats and 12 Republicans either retired or were retired by the voters, and then there's some that were supporters who, because they got reelected, now are getting a little wobbly as far as supporting us and don't really need much help from us right now. So there's a new coalition over there in the Senate being developed right now. They will introduce a bill at some point in time as soon as we figure out who's going to be in that coalition. Remember, we got to get 60 votes over there, so we got to get at least probably about 15 Democrats to cross over. People say, well, is that going to be a standalone bill? It's not strong enough to be a standalone bill, number one. It's not a hardcore issue that would stand by itself. It would have to be tacked on to another bill, so we've got to find a vehicle that can carry this particular bill. And the other problem with the standalone bill, if even it was introduced as a standalone bill, that would have to go in front of the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate, chaired by Barbara Boxer of California, who is not on our side. So it would not even get a committee hearing if it was introduced as a standalone. Where we got close to passing it in the last Congress, going back to June of last year, many of you recall that in June of last year we had a transportation funding crisis. Funding was going to run out for transportation bills. Both houses recognized that problem, and they said, well, we've got a bill in the Senate, we've got a bill in the House on funding transportation. Let's come together in a conference, work out the problems. You take the agreement back, they vote either yes or no on it, and then you pass it through and it solves the problem. Well, the House folks came over to that conference and they had 3 amendments. They had a bill to fund some harbor maintenance and construction projects. They had the Keystone XL pipeline, and they had us in there as a third bill. The House version of H.R. 2273, which was the McKinley bill. And we stayed in until the last minute when some folks from the Senate side came in with some programs they wanted funded, thought they could cram it through because we were 2 hours away from the deadline. And the House said, no, we're not doing that, and all amendments came off the table. So we got down to the 1-yard line, we couldn't punch it in using a football analogy. Nothing happened. It was, of course, running up to an election, so from about July 1 up to the November elections, nothing really happened that could carry our bill. In December 2012, there was a defense authorization that came up before Congress, and we tried to get on that bill. In that particular case, we were considered germane because many of the federal defense agencies use ash in their projects, and they regard it as a very valuable item. So that was considered germane. Senators Levin and McCain, who were the 2 Democrat and Republican leadership kind of governing what was going to happen with that bill, said, fine, you guys can come along with us as an amendment. And then Senator Boxer, a friend from California, found out about it and said, if that bill is on as an amendment, I'm going to slow up this defense authorization, we won't get it through. So they had to strip out the ash bill from that defense opportunity. So we missed in that one as well. We don't know where the future opportunities are going to be, but we know they're going to be there in some way, shape, or form. Going over to the third leg of the civics lesson, about a year ago or so, some anti-coal activists sued the EPA, saying that the EPA was in violation of the Resource Conservation Recovery Act because they had not reviewed ash regulations in 3 years, which they are required to review all regulations every 3 years, and EPA had not done that in this case, therefore they were in violation of record, they wanted relief from the court. Those of us on the beneficial use side thought there was a sue and settle strategy in play. It's a game played in Washington oftentimes where an advocacy group will sue a federal agency over an issue, force a court to bring them in and demand a settlement, when in fact that settlement is already negotiated and anybody else that wants to have input is left out in the cold. But we didn't want to be left out in the cold on this deal, letting the environmental interest groups that are opposed to coal-fired generation dictate our future. So 2 of the major marketers, Headwaters Resources and Boral Materials, jumped in and sued EPA on the same basis. They said, you haven't done anything with these regulations, they're damaging our business, we want you to set a deadline and ask the court to do that. Some interveners were allowed in. Interveners are allowed in at the pleasure of the courts, and the National Mining Association, which represents the coal mining interest, and the utility industry, represented by the Utility Solid Waste Activities Group, gained intervener status. There have been a number of motions made, questions regarding technical issues related to the RECRA, and also even standing issues, and there's a conference the judges called for April 26th to see where things are at. We're not really sure if he's going to be prepared to act on that particular date, or there will be a hearing of what's going to go on down there. The environmentalists want a deadline for a regulation. They want the court to say within 6 months you will issue a regulation which almost guarantees a hazardous waste regulation for coal ash disposal. EPA cannot answer all the questions it has to answer within 6 months regarding beneficial use. The marketers want want the court to tell EPA to declare whether they're going to manage as hazardous waste or non-hazardous waste. So they're really asking for two slightly different things, but again, that's really what's going on in court. Getting beyond some of that stuff, regulatory challenges that are coming up in utility industries, those utilities that are using ash ponds are going to have to close these ash ponds. These ash ponds are the source of really most of the complaints. They've been around for a long, long time. The ones that are causing problems, the ones that have been built in the last 20 years or so, and there haven't been a lot of ponds built in the last 20 years, have all the controls in them that you want. Liners, groundwater monitoring, leachate collection, all kinds of protections that you would see with any kind of a landfill or structure these days. But the real old ones that are 40 and 50 years old don't have those features, and some of them need to be fixed. A closure of ash ponds, you can imagine, a huge deal. You start pumping out the water and dewatering ash and all that kind of thing, and then going back in and filling and capping and all that kind of thing. It takes a while to do that, and certainly all the engineering and all the construction work that needs to be done with that is going to take time. And probably looking, if they passed a law today, it would take probably 10, 12 years before they could close all the ash ponds. Is that reasonable, Bruce? Does that sound about right? So 10 to 12 years to close all those ash ponds at a pretty big expense. Of course, we have other regulatory challenges that are going to affect the coal-fired generation industry. Some of those were already discussed. Bruce alluded to some of the issues related to NOx control, SOx control, mercury, and these kinds of things. These process controls that are demanded by EPA are going to change the nature of the ashes that we have. And the challenge is going to be for the marketers to work with the utilities, to work with the marketplace, to understand where we're going with these changes and what impact it's going to have on the final product, and particularly fly ash. We know fly ash is very touchy when it comes to things related to the changing performance, even, for example, mercury. If you're looking at activated carbon injection and that kind of thing, it's going to drive your LOI crazy. And how do we handle that? So there are a lot of issues related to clean air regulations that are going to be impacting things, and it's going to happen very quickly. Some of these programs, of course, are tied up in court right now. We don't know what the effective dates are going to be and that kind of thing, but the changes are coming. The interesting thing, if you pay attention to the media, is that you think that all the coal plants are closing down. And you pick up the newspaper and they say, well, this plant's closing, that plant's closing, no coal-fired generation in this state. Ontario is going to have no coal-fired plants within a year. However, the plants, by and large, that are closing are old plants, small to medium-sized plants that can't be retrofitted to meet EPA requirements economically. That's really what's going on. And utilities are in the power business. They make decisions based on what makes sense economically. And those small plants cannot be retrofitted economically to meet the requirements that the Clean Air Act is bringing into play. They also have some things happening with clean water regulations. Right now there's an issue related to water discharges, effluent limitation guidelines from power plants that EPA has collected some data on in a clean water investigation that they want to bring over to our issue, and they want to issue some what's called a notice of data availability to collect information on issues they discovered over in the clean water side relative to solid waste. So it just makes this even murkier all the time, murkier when it comes to looking at the future of what we're concerned about, coal-fired generation creating the kind of ash that the markets demand, and market demand is increasing. There's no question about that. And those are really the challenges that we're looking at right now. What comes next in terms of markets? Of course, there's continued pressure on coal-fired generation. You get all the noise from your anti-coal activists, but continued pressure on coal-fired generation simply because of market forces. Plants need to continue to add controls. When you're talking about scrubbers, scrubbers are millions and millions and millions of dollars to add to a power plant, and certainly utilities need to be able to justify that. Natural gas use is growing rapidly just because of the economics of it. However, we've seen natural gas spike and take a dive many times before. We've never seen the kind of supply that's available right now before, but there are also big issues like transmission. A lot of times folks will say, well, we've got all this natural gas, that's great. We'll just flip the switch in the power plant and we'll go to natural gas. It doesn't work like that. You have to get the gas from where it's at to the power plants. That requires transmission. The same thing with renewables. Folks say, well, we'll just build all these solar panels, we'll build all these wind farms and that kind of thing. But if you don't have the transmission to get it to where the power is needed, it doesn't do you much good. But natural gas use is in fact growing rapidly, and that's a challenge to coal-fired generation. So right now, coal-fired generation has gone from about 50% of our power down to about 35 to 40%, depending what time you're looking at. Renewable mania continues. We continue to think we're going to see wind and solar and other things going to take over big chunks of the utility market. That ain't true. It's always going to be a very minor amount, at least in the next 15 to 20 years. And of course, we know that all the things that are happening to power plants affect ash quantity and quality. Sometimes I get calls and folks say, well, there's no ash available in our market, or Raiders concrete producers will say that. What he's really telling us is that there's no ash available at the prices I'm used to paying. So, that ash may be available, but the number may be significantly higher because it may come from from far away. For example, one of our utilities was shipping ash from St. Louis to Boston recently to satisfy some demand over there. So, again, ash quality and quantity is going to be under a lot of pressure, and those of you interested in that are going to need to pay attention to that very closely. Solutions, it's always nice to finish with some positive information. Certainly beneficiation technologies, processing to offset impacts and controls, that's improving all the time. There are beneficiation things out there to handle loss of emission problems, whether it be carbon burnout, separation of particles, these kinds of things, some chemical programs, those sorts of things. There's all kinds of beneficiation things that are being developed constantly and coming to the market, so that's some good news there. Bruce alluded to this earlier, disposed ash. We saw recycling rates that haven't hit 50% yet, and kind of interesting that the EPA this past week made a statement in their budget proposal for next year that they want to see the recycling rate for coal combustion products go to 50% within the next 2 years. By doing what? Making hazardous? So, but in terms of what we've been doing, we've been disposing of ash for a long, long time in huge quantities. So depending on how that ash has been sent to landfills, and in some cases there's some research which shows ponded ash. If you think about ponded ash being reusable in concrete and that kind of thing, well, we put it in a pond, chemically it's been kind of rinsed and all that kind of thing, it's not going to be any good for concrete. There's some work that's shown that's not necessarily true. So we've got literally millions and millions of tons of ash in disposal, which could be possibly reprocessed. It's going to cost money, and brought to the market. So that's a potential gold mine sitting out there for the future. And of course, potential imports. We know around the world, coal-fired generation is increasing. Right now it's even increasing in Europe because the price of natural gas is extremely high in Europe, and they're burning more coal now than they have in a long, long time. Coal burn in the U.S. in the last few months has gone up. Certainly over in China and India and places like that, they're burning tremendous amounts of coal. In fact, when we had these regulatory issues pop up, I was kind of new on the job, and I was looking around, and I noticed the coal companies weren't saying too much about what EPA was trying to do with coal-fired generation. And after a while, it dawned on me that I should ask the question, where are the coal companies in this whole issue? And basically they said, look, if you don't want our coal in the United States, we have markets around the world we can sell it in. Why should we spend our time and money in Washington trying to tell the EPA what to do if we can just take it and put it on a ship and get it out of here and sell it somewhere else for more money? So, the coal market in the world is going to increase. It's continuing to grow rapidly, and it could well be that some imports will start to show up in the U.S. We know for a fact that we have imports coming in right now to cement companies to be used as a raw feed product for cement mills. So we could see actually ash being imported into the U.S. I want to thank you for this rapid fire overview. This is where you can contact us if you have any questions. We'd be happy to try and tell you what's going on. This is information as of Thursday at 2 o'clock. There was a hearing in the House before a subcommittee in the Energy and Commerce Committee in which they talked about introduction of another bill which David McKinley will be introducing here probably within the next 2 to 3 weeks. So, thank you very much.
We got time for one or two questions for Tom, if there's any.
Control the regulations we need to have the import of fly.
We really have no import restrictions on ash right now that I'm aware of. However, if you start to add the hazardous waste label, that starts to impact the import regulations. So we need. Pardon me?
Can you project what it may be?
Well, that market is so small right now. The import market is so small, it really is not that significant. I don't think they pay much attention to it, honestly. But when you start importing hazardous waste between different countries, you get lots of issues, lots of restrictions. Larry?
Is that true that by instituting all these regulations down the road, it's passed on to the consumer, and by the time the local utility bill is $500 to take care of a single-family home? It's too late.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when you look at, again, one of the things that the anti-coal crowd wants to do, they want to increase the rules surrounding the use of coal and the cost of using coal. And of course, the utilities don't care. They care. But they're in a regulated situation. They take their increased costs, pass them on to the ratepayer. So that, in fact, is true. And that's just the reality of the market. So in terms of hazardous waste, and that brings up another quick point, and I'll get you very quickly. If EPA creates hazardous waste rules for disposal, this is one of their theories. We can say ash that goes for disposal is going to be treated as hazardous waste, but ash that goes to beneficial use to a concrete plant is okay. They think that they can make that distinction and markets will accept it. But if you think about, number one, the utilities letting that ash out of their custody, that ain't going to happen. Because if you're a utility, are you going to let that ash go into the marketplace where it literally could end up in thousands of job sites around your community where you have potential tort exposure? Or are you going to take that ash and dispose of all of it because disposal costs are recoverable in rate structures? Defense of tort activity is not. So just making a simple business decision that if I dispose of 100% of my ash, I don't have the tort exposure, I can go and get that recoverable monies in my rate structure. But if I let go all these job sites around the community, I can't recover that money. And if you think that won't happen, if you think that's silly, just go back, those of you who are familiar with the sulfur wars in Southern California, the sulfate wars rather, in Southern California about 15 years ago, you know that it doesn't take a damage case to end up in court and start paying settlements. And in that particular case, in just that geographic portion of the United States, there were over $1 billion in settlements paid before that nonsense was stopped. And we can end up in the same boat. And think about an attorney, a very good attorney, stand in front of a jury and say, this material is exactly the same chemically and physically when it goes into a hazardous waste landfill as it does into your home in the wallboard and concrete and carpet backing. If it's hazardous here, it's got to be hazardous over here. And that's causing all these health effects to my client. And if you start developing that argument, it doesn't take much to see that you've got a problem. So, again, long answer to your question, Larry, but those numbers are going to, it's like everything else, it always filters back to the ratepayer.
Got one more quick question in front here.
How many percent of the power plants are gas powered?
I really don't know. Bruce, do you have any idea what percentage of gas we're running gas now? It changes quickly.
I guess around a third.
About a third. So we're still about 20% nuclear. Gas maybe 30 or 40%. Coal around 35 to 40, about 5% renewables.
All right, thank you, Tom.